Thank you. My name is Keith Lewis. I'm an alcoholic. Thank you, Ed, very much for those kind words. The truth is that whenever I ask somebody to pray first, it's because I haven't the foggiest idea what to say. And so that's why I was praying just a minute ago. I'm just really thrilled to be here. I want to thank the committee for asking me, and you know, family is so important, as Ed has just shown us. And this past May, last month, two important things happened to me. One, I celebrated 27 years of continuous sobriety in Alcoholics Anonymous. And that surprises anybody who ever knew me. And more surprising than that is last month I celebrated 11 years of marriage to my wonderful wife, Julia. Would you please stand up? And most people, including my ex-wife, find that amazing. I am thrilled to be here. It's such an honor. I was telling Julia last night, I told her, I said, I'm going to have a hard time this weekend. I just feel like I want to burst into tears. Everything about this place is special, and then to see so many old friends and things, it's probably more than I can handle. I am a Buckeye. I was born in a small town, Martins Ferry, Ohio, and I now live in, there's one other person here. All the rest died of alcoholism, but it was a great place to be born. I now live in Wilmington, North Carolina, and I'm a member of the Midtown group of Alcoholics Anonymous, and we meet on Mondays and Thursdays at 7 o'clock. And if you're ever in Wilmington, on a Monday or Thursday evening, if you'll come to the Midtown group at Pearsall Presbyterian Church on Market Street, I promise you'll be made to feel welcome. We have a wonderful home group. I'm not saying it's the best in the world, but it's the one that's working best for me right now. As they say, I'm from Ohio, and I'm Irish. I'm the second child. Now, being Irish is not a unique accomplishment in Alcoholics Anonymous, but I'm the eldest son and the second child in a family of 11 children. I won't tell you what church I went to. I'll let you guess. It has something to do with bingo. I'm not going to say any more than that. And I would have told you that we were poor. And I would have been wrong about that, just like I was about everything else. We weren't poor. We didn't have any excess material goods, but we were anything but poor. I had a mother who every day I let her would hug me and kiss me and tell me she loved me. And I had a dad who, whenever I'd let him, would spend time with me. Every day he would spend time with me. And that's great wealth. I had brothers and sisters who I loved and who loved me. The problem was my receiver was broken. And over the years, I've heard alcoholism described a lot of ways, and they're all true. But the thing that strikes me about alcoholism is even before I drank, I had a unique inability to experience the love that always surrounded me. I was a problem solver or a problem finder. I was like a Geiger counter for sickness. Even as a little kid, if there was a problem, I could spot it in a heartbeat, and I was always looking for what was wrong. Consequently, I never saw what was right. One of the things that really attracted me to Alcoholics Anonymous when I got here was the fact that as a group of people, you're the most positive people I've ever seen in my life. Truly positive people. All day yesterday, I saw one guy who was just negative about everything, and I just loved him. You know, it just points out that the other 8 or 10,000 are doing just fine. Thank you. And but I was that kid. I was a kid who had something lived under his bed, and it would move around down there at night. It wasn't there in the daytime. It was only there at night, and I knew what it was there for. It was waiting for me to dangle my little legs over the side of the bed, and I was history. I knew that, and I don't know what it was, but I just always lived with fear. The book tells me that I'm driven by 100 forms of fear, and that's always been true in my life. I've always been driven by fear. I was talking to a group of guys in the penitentiary this past week, and I was telling them that fear drove me. And And I spent my whole life showing them. I never knew who they were, but I had to prove to them that I was okay. And I spent my whole life running around, being driven by fear and proving to them that I was okay. And an insane way to live. I like to talk about my first drinking experience. I think it's important. If you're gonna be a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, you ought to drink. Now, I'll be honest, I've bumped into a few people I have some doubts about, but that's their story. But I drank the first time when I was 5 years old. I was at home. I didn't go out a lot when I was 5. And my dad was watching us. My mom was either at the bingo or having a baby or something. And Dad was watching myself and my brother, Dumb Denny. Dumb Denny's a year younger than I am. And I guess Dad thought it'd be kind of funny, and he gave us each a beer. And nothing happened to me. Nothing. And Den, on the other hand, was having a spiritual awakening. He slid out of the chair and he was rolling around on the floor singing Mary Had a Little Lamb and other drinking songs. And my dad panicked and he wrestled him to the ground and he got his clothes off and he put his little jammies on him and he took him up and put him in bed. And he was singing and carrying on. And he said, "Son," he said, "go to bed." And he said, "Now don't tell your mother about this and I'll take you to the movies." I said, "Well, that's fine. You know, when you're 5, they don't negotiate a lot." And I'll never forget this. Little Denny stood up in his crib and he urinated on the floor. And I remember thinking, you know, there's a kid who's powerless over alcohol and whose life has become unmanageable. And it's the saddest thing. Denny just never really made it. We're not very proud of this, but I'll give you some examples. Denny went to one college. Ohio University, as a matter of fact. Yeah. Bunch of losers like Denny here. He had one major. It gets worse. He graduated in 4 years. I never heard of such a thing. You know? He went to one graduate school. Okay? Graduated first in his class. He had like 8 job offers. He took one. You know. And the strangest thing of all, he's married to one woman, you know, and he just retired as a vice president of a large international corporation. Now here's a guy who had the world in the palm of his hands when he was 4 years old. He just let it slip through his fingers. You know? I had to work at this thing. I was 21 years old before I urinated on the bedroom floor for the first time, and I hung in there. I'm no quitter. You know, I went to a small high school in Valero, Ohio. I like to talk about my friend Sister Victoria. Sister Victoria was a nun who was a librarian, and she would, and when you served detention, you'd serve detention in a library. And Sister Victoria is one of those strange birds who would run around saying things like, you know, every boy's a prince and every girl's a princess because we have a father who's a king. You know, silly stuff like that. And when you got into trouble and you had to serve detention, you served it with Sister Victoria. Now, I spent a lot of time with Sister Victoria. I think if we'd have had any money, I'd have been diagnosed as an acting out adolescent. We were poor, so I was just a punk. And when you served detention with Sister Victoria, you had to make rosary beads. You know, she'd give you wire and pliers and these little beads, and you had to make rosary beads. And she used to put me behind a magazine rack. She said I was a prince, but I was contagious. And so you had to make rosary beads. And I spent many hours with her. And over the 4-year period, I made hundreds and hundreds of rosary beads. Mine were always different. Instead of 10 beads in each decade, I used to put 11 beads in each decade. And so after 4 years, there were hundreds and hundreds of mutant rosary beads all over the world. And you know, she never said anything. Never said anything, and you can't not let them know. I mean, it would have been a waste of 4 years. So I went to her and said, you know what I've been doing for the last 4 years? And she said, yes, you sly little prince. She said, you've been putting extra beads in all the rosaries, and I know why. And I'm thinking, I hope she tells me, because I haven't the foggiest notion of why I do these things. And she said, people all over the world are praying extra prayers, and God's going to give you all the credit. Don't you just hate people like that? And then she took both of my hands in her hands, and she was a spiritual person. Like you find some of them in Alcoholics Anonymous. They look you in the eyes. You know the kind. Sort of obnoxious, I'm a shoe person. I like to look at shoes. But they look you in the eyes, and they say things to you to scare you. That's why they do it. And she held both my hands, and she said, you're a very special little prince, and God's going to use you in a special way. She said, one day you're going to go all over the world and tell God's children how very much he loves them. And so if you don't know, God does love you. That's for Sister Victoria, but it terrified me, because the one thing I wanted to do was to be left out. I just wanted to be left out. I wanted to be left out. I wanted to be left alone. I didn't want to have to account for anything. I knew if I tried it, I'd mess it up. And I just assumed not be noticed and get through life. And I graduated from high school, much to everyone's surprise, and I didn't know what to do. And back then, if you went to the military. If you either went to college or you went to the military. It's one or the other. And for a man, it wasn't if you went, it was where and when. And so I went home and took one of my very first inventories. I took my shirt off, and I stood in front of the mirror, and I flexed my muscles, and I turned sideways, and I stuck my chest out and curled my arms, and it was amazing. And I was 5 feet 1 inch tall, and I weighed 113 pounds. And whatever else I was a born killer. So I took a bus over to Wheeling, West Virginia, and joined the Marine Corps. And I forgot to tell my parents. And I wasn't yet 18 years of age, so they had to sign my papers. And the recruiter showed up at my house, and my poor mother about died. Gee. And they finally said to me, son, are you sure you want to do this? I said, I'm positive. And so they signed. And all night my mother cried. I'll never forget it. She kept saying, Scott, they'll kill him. And my dad kept saying, don't worry, Pat, they won't take him. And so with that vote of confidence, the next morning we took a taxi cab to the Trailways bus station in Wheeling, West Virginia, and I got on a bus and I went to Pittsburgh. It was the second longest trip I'd ever been on in my life. Once I came to Cleveland, but the game was rained out. And I knew nothing about anything. I was this frightened little kid who'd never been anywhere, never knew anything, and acting like he belonged someplace. And I'll never forget it as long as I lived. I went through the physical. It was a bad year, and they took you if you had a pulse. So that afternoon, I was sworn into the United States Marine Corps, and I had no earthly idea of what was going to happen or what I was supposed to do or anything. And there were 3 men from the Pittsburgh area who also joined the same day, and we were slated to leave that night at midnight. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the guy said to me, hey kid, we're going to go over and have a few beers and a sandwich. You want to come along? And I said, that's just what I was thinking. I always acted like I was in the know. And so we went over to a bar in Pittsburgh, and I'll never forget this as long as I live. The bar was filled with real men, you know the kind, and they all had real women with them. Real women are women who hang around with real men. And I knew that, and I used to get what was left. And we walked into this place, and the bartender said to us, what do you want? And I had no idea how to answer that, and so I did what I always did. I watched what other people did, and the guy said, well, we'll have a beer and a sandwich. And I said, me too. And he came back, and he asked the same question, and they gave the same answer. And he came back the third time. I knew the answer. Because between the second and third drink, my life changed. It was miraculous. I'll never forget it as long as I live. I stood up. I didn't mean to stand up. I just couldn't help myself. And I looked down, and the floor was 6 feet 4 inches below me. And my right shoulder was out there, and my left shoulder was out, and the muscles were rippling through my body. And that mind that had been so filled with fear and anxiety and trepidation and doubt, all of a sudden, boom, was just crystal clear. For the first time in my life, I saw the big picture. And I remember thinking, it's so simple. Why didn't I see it before? It's so simple. And then I looked around that room, and my heart broke, because the room was filled with a bunch of pathetic, sniveling little men. And all of them had women with them, or looking at me with their hungry eyes. And And I'll never forget, I just went from table to table, just talking to people. And I'd never done that before in my life. I was answering questions they didn't even ask. I answered them before they asked me. I was a genius. And I kept drinking. And about 11 o'clock, the guy said, "We better go. We have to catch the train." And it seemed to me that those people in that bar in Pittsburgh were saying, "Please don't go." And I said, "I have to go and make the world safe for democracy." And I left, and I went and got on a train. Now, I assume I got on the train. And the reason I assume that is because the next morning I woke up on the train. Now, I was to make that assumption a lot in the next 12 years, but an amazing thing, I was lying on the floor of the Pullman coach, which isn't where most people lay, and someone had wet the floor I was lying on. It's the strangest thing. And they'd also wet me, whoever it was. And so I changed my clothes, and a terrible thing happened. I was again 5 feet 1 inch tall. I was 17 years old, and I was terrified. But now I knew what to do about it. And so that morning, the four of us went over and drank breakfast. And that night, I fell off the train in a place called Yamasee, South Carolina. If you hadn't been there, I wouldn't bother. But somebody moved a step or something, and I fell across the next set of railroad tracks. And there was a very rude man there that they'd sent to greet us. And he was screaming obscenities at us. It was just completely uncalled for. And I got up and I tried to explain to this cretin that he'd get along a lot better if he treated us with a little respect. And he was a very limited man. He never seemed to grasp exactly what it was I was trying to say to him. He's just screaming so much. And they say you can learn from every experience. And what I learned from that experience is you can do a lot of push-ups drunk. That's what I learned from that experience. I don't mean to be indelicate, but you can do push-ups and throw up at the same time, in case you're wondering, which is what I did all night. And the next morning, they took me to Parris Island, and I was introduced to the United States Marine Corps. And I want to tell you, I loved it. I loved everything about the Marine Corps, and I often wondered, that doesn't sound right to me, even to this day. But I did. I just loved everything about it. And I think I know why now. It's taken me years to figure this out. All my life, I guessed at what I was supposed to do. I guessed at life. That's the best way I can put it. I guessed at it. I had nothing, no knowledge, no nothing. And in the Marine Corps, they have a very clear idea what it is they want you to do. And they're not a bit shy about sharing it with you. And so for the first time in my life, I knew what to do. And so I did it. And I did it fairly well. I won Dress Blues Award, Outstanding Man's Award. I gained about 30 pounds, and I grew a few inches. And it was a wonderful experience for me. And I made up my mind that I'd stay in the Marine Corps forever if they'd let me. The problem was I was alcoholic. And let me tell you what I think being alcoholic means to me. Okay? Being alcoholic means that I'll be very enthusiastic about a way of life, the kind of enthusiasm you hear here. I mean, think about this. There are probably more busted marriages in this room than in any average room in the world. And yet a guy, asks a girl to marry him, we all cheer. Why? Well, we know the next time is going to be better. That's why, because that's just the way we think, isn't it? And so we're enthusiastic about stuff, and that's the way I always was about life. I was always enthusiastic about life. But then gradually, or not so gradually, I began to violate every principle associated with that way of life. Within 4 years, I'd gotten everything I wanted, all my meritorious promotions. I'd gotten an appointment to officers' candidate school. I'd gotten everything I set out to get. The problem was, I'd violated so many principles associated with being a United States Marine that the only thing left for me to do was to get out and then to blame them for what happened to me. And in a nutshell, that's alcoholism for me. I became married. And within a few years, I'd violated virtually every principle associated with being a husband. Not because I wanted to, just because that's what happened next. I'm convinced of one thing. When our book talks about this program being about building character, I'm absolutely convinced that it's true. I think what Alcoholics Anonymous is a program to reconstruct, or maybe to construct, the character of a guy like me, who had virtually lost everything, every shred of decency, every shred of grace, every shred of kindness, everything. I violated virtually every principle associated with being a human being before I came to you. What the 12 steps allow me to do is to turn that around. So that's alcoholism. And I won't bore you with a lot of drunk stories. I had a lot of drunk stories. I drank for 12 years. And where it ended up for me, well, I want to talk about not being able to not drink. We had 2 children. My second child is a daughter named Kimberly. And when Kimberly was born, she was about 2 pounds or less. And she was very, very ill. She had a very serious disease. And she was born in a hospital in which I worked. And I was cowering in a room watching her in the dark. It was a room across the hall from the neonatal nursery. And they had her on this special machine, and they said they didn't think she'd live, and if she lived, she'd be retarded. And I knew what to do, because I watched my father in situations like this, and my father knew what to do. He would go to his wife, and he would put his arm around her, and he would say, "We'll do this together." And he'd get on his knees with her, and they would pray. And then he would put it in God's hands. I knew what to do. I sat across the hall, and I couldn't do it. I watched my wife walk back and forth in front of that nursery for hours. And then at about 72 hours after the baby's birthday, it's the most critical time, I watched my wife go into that nursery and baptize our baby because they didn't think that she would live through the night. And I wasn't competent or capable of going and doing anything. I sat like the coward I had become in a dark room and watched. And in utter dismay, I ran down to a chapel. I worked at Georgetown University, which is a Catholic university, and I was raised Catholic. And the tabernacle was always a special place for me as a kid. And I ran down to the tabernacle, and I got on my knees, and I wept, and I begged God to let my little girl live. I said, "If you'll let my little girl live, I'll do anything. If you'll let her live, I won't drink." And I was drunk in 12 hours, and I never want to forget that. I drank when I thought drinking would kill my little girl. That's the power of alcoholism. The power of alcoholism. Blaise Pascal, the great French philosopher, once said that God created man in his own image, and unfortunately man returned a favor. And I'd gotten so sick that I created a God that would kill a little girl because her dad was sick. And of course, God doesn't function like that. And Kimberly is now 30 years of age, and a month before last, she had our 3rd grandchild, her 2nd daughter. But I never want to forget. I never want to forget that I thought drinking would kill her, and I had to drink anyway. Never want to forget that. You know, shortly after that, 3 years later, I was alone. I'd lost everything. I was living in the basement of a house in the Skid Row section of Washington, D.C. And it was over. It was just, I went in to die. That was it. There was nothing left to live for. My life had ended. I knew that. And I went into what passed for a bathroom in the Skid Row dive I was living in to die. And I began to take pills or something. I don't know. It was very confusing to me now. But the one thing I do remember was I asked God, or I told God that at least it's over. I'm 29 years old, at least it's over. And I heard a woman spoke to me, a woman's voice, and she said, "When you're 29, it's not supposed to be over. It's supposed to be starting." And I remembered that my estranged wife had given me a phone number to call in case I needed help. And I ran in and I looked for that number and I found it, and I called it, and it was a little treatment center. There's a man here named Ernie, and I'm not going to embarrass him, but that treatment center was there because Ernie made sure it was there. And I called and I spoke to a woman named Dorothy. I had no idea who they were or what they did. And I had no idea I was an alcoholic. I was convinced I was insane and evil and all these other things. But I thought that alcohol was the only friend I had left in the world. And I called her and she talked to me for just a short period of time. And I hung up the phone and I looked and I had a 5th of scotch on the draining board. And I ran over and began to pour it out. And I knew, and I didn't know anything about alcoholism. I didn't know Alcoholics Anonymous existed. All I knew was if I took one more drink of alcohol, I would die. And knowing that would never keep me from taking it. And I started to pour it out, and I knew I wouldn't. I knew I was powerless over the stuff in that bottle. I knew that left to my own devices, I must drink again. And I threw the bottle in the sink and it broke. And if it had bounced, I don't think I'd be here. And I waited 3 days to go to this place, and I never want to forget those 3 days. I heard music in places that music doesn't play. I was in a bank trying to borrow a few bucks to go out there, and I was listening to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and I realized that I was the only one hearing it, that nobody else in that bank could hear what I was hearing. And they weren't seeing the little things out of the corner of their eyes like I was seeing too. And I got in that car one day to drive out to this place, and it was 30 miles away, and it took me 5 hours to get there. I was overwhelmed with terror. And I was sick, and I wet my pants, and I'm changing my pants beside my car on Route 29 outside of Washington, D.C., and my Phi Beta Kappa key fell out of my pocket. And I wondered what had happened. This was a kid who had all that potential, and I wondered what had happened. And I show up at this place, and I got there just about in time to go to what they called an AA meeting. And I didn't know AA existed. I worked in one of the finest medical centers in the country, and I didn't know AA existed. Now, there were people there who did, but I didn't. And I said, what's AA? And they said, it's a place where a bunch of old people get together and they just talk about drinking. And I thought, well, what the hell? And got in a bus and away we went. And one of the things that changed my life happened. We heard Cersei and the old timers talking about those pivotal points last night. Well, the pivotal point for me was I walked up to this meeting, and there was an old man at the door. We called him a greeter. And he shook my hand firmly. And he said, you're new, aren't you? And I thought, oh my God, he's psychic. And he smiled, and he looked me in the eye. I didn't want to look back, but he did. And he looked me in the eye, and he said, if you keep coming here, son, you never have to drink again. And I just wanted to scream at him, you don't know me. I'm a guy who drinks when he thinks drinking will kill his little girl. But he did know me because he was an alcoholic. And from that day to this one, I've not had to take a drink of alcohol. May the 13th, 1973. And it's been a wild ride. It's just been a magnificent, magnificent ride. You know, the book says we don't want to miss this. What's gone on in my life is just unbelievable. The graces. I sponsor a fellow who's spent the better part of the last 30 years in prison, and he got out 2 weeks ago. And I haven't had this much fun in years. It's just wonderful seeing this guy. He's coming up on 3 years of sobriety. Don C. has asked me up to Sister Ignatius' celebration on Labor Day, and I'm going to bring him with me. And we were talking, and I said, do you want to fly up or do you want to drive up? And he said, well, I've never flown, we better drive. And he said, you know, I've never driven either. And I said, you got a lot of life ahead of you, and he does. You know, I was a guy who was, I think, certifiably insane when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous. I really mean that. I was an emotional basket case. I'm not proud of this, but I once attacked a man in an AA meeting because he was insulting people. And he insulted me. And the next thing I knew, I was strangling him on a table in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And the group applauded. They said they'd been waiting a long time for a guy like me to come along. I mean, but you know, I've never been able to do anything to make you drive me off. My first 12-step call, I went to the D.C. jail with my sponsor, Dan, and Dan's chirping away with this guy, you know, through the phone. So I can hear Dan, I just can't hear the other guy. And he talked to him about 45 minutes, and then he said, I'm going to let you talk to my friend. He said, he's doing real well. He's sober about 60 days now, and he's doing really well. He said, I'll let you talk to him for a few minutes. I'm thinking, a few minutes? I got a lot to say to this guy. And I grabbed the phone, and I began to preach to this guy and tell him what he ought to do and everything. And you know, after about 3 minutes, I took a breath. And finally, he said, well, hey, buddy, he said, this AA stuff's fine for a guy like you. He said, but I'm a Fulbright scholar. And I just lost it. And I began to scream, well, Mr. Fulbright scholar, one of us is leaving here in a few minutes and the other one isn't. What do you think about that, Mr. Fulbright scholar? And my sponsor saw it wasn't going well, so he's trying to get the phone back, and I wasn't finished yet. So I was down on the floor, cradling the phone, screaming at this guy, and first the other visitors began looking in our cubicle, and then finally the guards came and looked in, and Dan got the phone away from me, and he said, yes, I'll come back tomorrow. Yeah, I'll come alone. And hung up the phone. And I knew I was going to get kicked out of Alcoholics Anonymous. And you know, we walk out to the parking lot, and he doesn't say anything. Don't you hate it when they do that to you? Doesn't say a thing to me. And so finally I said to him, that was pretty bad, wasn't it, Dan? And he said, well, I'll be honest with you, Keith. He said, most guys wouldn't have done it that way. He said, but you'll discover that everyone develops their own technique in Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's the last I ever heard of it. And that's the way this thing works. So if you're kind of new here, you know, don't worry. You fit. Trust us, you fit. You really do. I mean, everybody fits here. Now, it helps if you don't drink, you know, but it really does. They seem to respect you a lot more if you don't drink. I don't know, they're sort of funny about those things, but even if you do drink, you fit. We all fit into Alcoholics Anonymous, and that's the magnificence of this thing. I was a guy who couldn't go into grocery stores and things for very long. I couldn't be around people, and so I used to shop in the 10-item line in a grocery store. You know, I'd run in, I'd grab a basket, I'd run around, I'd grab 10 things, and I'd run up, and by the time I got to the checkout, I'd be shaking, and then he'd check me out, and I'd run out of there, and I'd start breathing again. And one time, I guess it was a bad day or something, and I get to the checkout thing, and the guy said, "Sir, you have 11 items, and this is a 10-item checkout line." And I just lost it. And I began to scream, "You're right. I don't deserve to shop here. I don't know why you let me in here in the first place." And he said, "Sir, it's all right. It's all right. I was just kidding." And I said, No, you're right, you're right. So I turn around, and there are like 6 people in line behind me. And I started saying to them, "You can sleep at night. This guy's awake." You know, and all they want to do is buy a few things and go home for dinner, you know, and they got to put up with me. And finally the manager of the store came over and said, "Sir, what's the matter?" And by this time I'm crying. And I said, "You ought to be proud of this man. You know, he caught me sneaking through a line with 11 items. I said, you need to promote this man." And I burst into tears and I ran out of the store. Now that's bad enough, but the next thing I did was really dumb. I called my sponsor. And he said, "You did what? Get over here." So I go over there and everything, and he put me in a car. You know what he did? He took me back to the Safeway on Georgetown Road, or Wisconsin Avenue in Georgetown, and just pointed. I said, "Don't make me go in there." He said, "Get in there." And so I went in, the manager came running over. He said, "Sir, are you all right?" I said, "Well, tough life. Almost died of alcoholism last month. Mother had a square nipple." I don't know what all I told him about. You know, there were a lot of... and then, you know, and then I had to shop there. My sponsor made me shop there, you know. So I'd go and I'd get my basket. I'd go in that line, and the guy'd look at me and he'd smile. He'd say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'd say, yeah, just check me out. Insane. Couldn't sleep. And so I'd just drive around all night, and I'd read this stuff that, you know, Thomas Jefferson said and Abraham Lincoln said. I'd ride around and look at all the monuments. I just couldn't sleep, you know. And I'd never remember the next day what I read today, so it was always new. And I'd always go, "That's amazing." And one day I laid down by the Jefferson Memorial. They had a little grasser off to the side, and I laid down. I fell sound asleep. I was amazed. I said, "Man, it's not that you can't sleep. You've been trying to sleep in the wrong place." So I went home, I got my sleeping bag, and I brought it back, and I laid it out, you know. I lay down, went right to sleep. And somebody's kicking my foot, and I woke up, and there was a parked policeman. And he said, "Son, what are you doing here?" I said, "I'll tell you." And I told him my story. He said, "No kidding." I said, yeah, it's the only place I can sleep. And he said, "Well, I'll tell you what, buddy." He said, "You come down here and sleep whenever you want to." So I did. Every 2-3 days, I wouldn't be able to sleep. I'd go down, I'd lay the sleeping bag, I'd go right to sleep. And I'd hear something like, "Hey, Keith, is that you?" I'd say, "Yeah." "How many days?" 63 days. "That's great. You want some coffee?" "No, I better get some rest. I have to go to work." "Okay. Don't worry, we'll keep an eye on you," you know. It's wonderful. It was an insane time. But it was, every day was better than the day before, and that's why I stayed. And I'm convinced that what makes Alcoholics Anonymous is that the people around us believe that we'll get sober before we believe it. You know, I hung with a bunch of men and women who used to say to me, "You can't miss." I'd say, "You sure?" They'd say, "We're positive. We've seen a lot of people come through here, and you can't miss." I said, "Well, thank God, because I'm thinking I'm going to die any minute." No. You're wrong about that," they'd say. "You can't miss." I said, "Well, thank you very much." And sometimes I call my sponsor. I say, Dan, it's Keith. He said, yeah. I said, you sure? He's positive. It's okay. I hang up. That's all I needed to know. But I had a lot of thinking problems. And remember one time I got up sober just like 6-8 weeks. And I got ready. I got my car to go to work. And this is a true story. I forgot where I worked. I couldn't remember where I worked. And I panicked. I said, oh, my God, where do you work? And, so my sponsor had given me his card and taped a dime to it and said, whenever you're in trouble, he said, you call me. So I stopped at a phone booth and I called him. Now, how are you going to tell your sponsor that you forgot where you work, And so he answered the phone. I said, good morning, Dan. How you doing? He said, I'm fine. He said, how are you? I said, fine. I was wondering how you are. And he said, where are you? He said, what's all that noise? I said, I'm calling you from a phone booth. He said, your car break down? I said, no, car's fine, Dan. I'm just wondering how you're doing. And he said, what's the matter, buddy? I said, well, it's not a big problem, Dan. I said, I can't seem to remember where I work. And he said, oh, you got the old I can't remember where I work problem, huh? He said, a lot of us have had that. And he said, it's kind of scary, isn't it? I said, it really is. I said, are you sure I'm not crazy? He said, well, we don't know yet. He said, we don't rule on things like that. He said, what I know is that you're not drinking. And he said, I know you're an alcoholic and I know you're not drinking. He said, but, we won't know if you're crazy or not for a couple of years. And so we talked and he said, the book says it's a very unnatural thing to pour alcohol in our brain. And he said, this will straighten out for you. He said, I'm sure of it. I said, boy, I hope so. And then he said to me, he said, if you ever have this problem again, I'd like to make a suggestion. I said, well, anything. I'm honest, willing, and open-minded. And he said, if you ever have this problem again, I'd like to suggest that you take a look at the front bumper of your car because you have a parking sticker for the university. And I remember thinking, where do these people learn these things, I mean, the thing that amazes me about you is how easy you make life look. I mean, you do it so well. I mean, I've always been impressed with the way you do stuff. I really mean it. I mean that from the bottom of my heart. We had a bunch of old-timers here last night. If you missed it, you missed a treat. You really need to get that tape. It was just wonderful. But if you're kind of new, I'd like to warn you about old-timers, okay? Stay away from them, okay? They are not nice people. I mean that. They really aren't. And I can prove it to you. They'll tell you things that aren't true. Like they'll say things like, we come to AA because we need to. That's a lie. That's a lie. They don't need to come to AA. The only reason they come to AA is the only enjoyment they get out of life is watching people like you and me suffer. That's why the old-timers come. Now, if you don't believe that, you find an old-timer and tell them a problem or her problem. First thing they do is laugh. And never, Yeah. And if you really want to make their day, tell them a problem about sex. They love problems about sex. What do they say? No sex. Right? They're not having sex anymore, and they don't want us to have sex either. That's what they want. So I go to this old timer and I tell him I had a little problem. I was sober about 90 days and I was impotent, which will put a crimp in your sex life. And so I beat around the bush and finally he said, what's the problem? I told him. He said, a lot of us had that problem. He said, you'll get better. I said, when? I thought it was important. And he said, what do you care? You got a full social calendar? And this guy told me to do something. And old-timers always speak in riddles. And they tell you to do stuff that's got nothing to do with a problem. You ever notice that? It's like they didn't hear what you said. It's just got nothing to do with the problem. And so this old guy said to me, he said, I'll tell you what. He said, I want you to do something for me. I said, anything. And he said, I want you to borrow some lipstick from one of the girls in the program. He said, no, I don't want you doing anything else with the girls. He said, oh, that's right, you can't. He said, I want you to borrow some lipstick and I want you to go right on the mirror. Keith, you are wrong. And I said, well, I can't do that, you see, because my problem is I have a poor self-image and I need to be affirmed. Don't ever talk that way to an old-timer. They hadn't read any of those books. And I didn't want to owe anything to anybody, especially a woman, right, guys? And So I went and bought a tube of lipstick, and I went home and I wrote on a mirror, Keith, you were wrong. I just know you're all crazy. I mean, what's this got to do with anything, you know? I threw it in a waste can, and I went to bed. It was a normal night. Remember a normal night, 3 months? Oh, gee. I closed my eyes, my mind woke up for the first time and took off, you know? You're never going to make it. They're going to find out you're crazy. You don't belong in Alcoholics Anonymous. You belong in a nut house. Da-da-da. You're going to be alone the rest of your life. What difference does it make? You're impotent. You know, just all night, you know. And finally, about 4 in the morning, I'd fall asleep, and then the leg cramps. Remember the leg cramps? Oh, geez. And then 15 minutes before I had to go to work, I'd go sound asleep. Boom. It would take 3 alarm clocks to wake me up, and my mind was still there, and it was saying, you're going to go to work today, and they're going to find out you don't know how to do your job, and they're going to fire you. That's all right, you're hopelessly in debt anyway. Just, you know, a normal morning, just a normal morning. And I started the coffee, I just wanted to cry. And I went in the bathroom, and it said on the mirror, Keith, you were wrong. I said, well, thank God, because if I'm right, I'm in a hell of a lot of trouble. And so if you're new, if you're kind of new, be wrong. The great gift that Alcoholics Anonymous gives you is being wrong. If we can be wrong, we can change dramatically. But if we got to be right, we're going to stay the same. Think about that, okay? You know, I moved from Washington, D.C. to North Carolina in 1980. And North Carolina is truly my home. I love it. I'm a naturalized citizen. My wife is from North Carolina. They're trying to teach me the language. I haven't learned it yet, but I'm still working on it. But magnificent things have happened to me in my years of sobriety. And of course, they're directly related to the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And if I could, I wanted to take just a couple minutes and talk about some of the experiences. I just met someone from my hometown today, and I'm reminded that this coming next weekend we're having a family reunion, and so next weekend I'll be in Martins Ferry with my family, and 28 years ago they took turns making excuses for why they forgot to tell me when the reunion was, and they just plain did not want me around. I was an obnoxious, overbearing, sick, crazy fool. And now they are anxiously awaiting my arrival. And the following weekend, I get to speak at the West Virginia State Convention in Wheeling, which is 2 miles from where I grew up. 6 people up there without shoes. One old timer, he has somebody else's shoes. So, but I get to go there, and I get to be with my family, and we get to celebrate what Alcoholics Anonymous has done in our lives. You know, the book says that as an alcoholic, I go through life like a tornado. But you know, as a recovering member of Alcoholics Anonymous, I go through life making a difference too. It's a wonderful difference. I have a brother, Larry, who's sober. He has 2 sons who are sober. I have a niece who's now a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. I have sisters and brothers who go to Al-Anon. I mean, it's just, what has happened to our family is magnificent. And I've been able to go and make amends to my family members. And I'd like to talk, if I could, about that. I was a guy who grew up blaming his father. Get this, he never told me he loved me. He was a guy who raised 11 children, right? Worked all the time, just to get by. And he never took time out to say, I love you, little Keefy. Just never did it. And it was that or mom's square nipple. That's why I was an alcoholic. I knew it was one thing or the other. And what I decided I needed to do was to go home and make amends to my dad. And I'd come home, and I'd be there 5 minutes. I'd drive from Washington, D.C. to Ohio. I'd be there 5 minutes. I'd be so angry I couldn't see straight. I'd get in the car and drive back to Washington, D.C. And my father said to my mother one day, you know, he's a nice boy, but he drives a long way for a cup of coffee. And he just didn't understand. And you know, some years later, I had a little house down at the ocean on Carolina Beach, and my mom and dad had never seen the ocean. Well, they never were on a vacation. They just spent all their time working and raising children and sending them to college and things. And so they came down to visit, and my dad just fell in love with the ocean. So I said to him, I had to move for a couple of years to Alabama, and I said, would you keep an eye on the house for me? And he said, well, I'll keep an eye on it. He kept an eye on it, but whenever I traveled through North Carolina, I'd stop and see Dad, and we'd sit down and talk, and I kept praying about this amends and kept praying about this amends, and he told me a story one day, and I finally knew why I owed my father an amends. I had learned by this time that the key to happiness was to follow God's law, and one of God's laws is to honor my parents. And I began honoring my parents, not agreeing with them, just honoring them, showing them the kind of respect that you showed me and you taught me to show others. And my father and I were sitting and talking one day, and he said to me, remember the first day you went to work? And I said, yeah, sure. I said, down at Jimmy Lamont's bowling alley in Bridgeport. And he said, remember that I took you to lunch that day? And I said, I don't remember that. He said, yeah, we went to Louis' hot dog stand. Now here's a guy who didn't care, okay? He said, do you remember what you had for lunch? And I said, I'm going to go out on a limb here, Dad. Did I have a hot dog? He said, of course you had a hot dog. And he said, do you remember what you drank? And I said, yeah, I drank an orange pop. I always drank orange pop. He said, not this time. He said, this time you drank a root beer. He said, I think that you thought men who worked drank root beer because I drank root beer. And he said, I took you down to the bus stop, and I said to you, want me to come with you on your first day? And you said, no thanks, Dad, I'll do it myself. And he said, my 12-year-old little boy got on the bus, and he said, I watched the bus till it was out of sight, and you never looked back. And he said, from that day on, you never let me do anything for you. He said, your brothers and sisters let me help them go to college and everything, but you never let me do anything for you from that day on. And I realized what the book says is true, that most people treat me the way I make them treat me. And I realized that I owed my father an amends because I never allowed him to do what he did best, which was to be my father. And I thought I was supposed to do these things, and it's always been difficult for this alcoholic to be loved. It amazes me that the woman I'm married to loves me the way she does. We sort of agree that, we have one goal in common, and that is my happiness. And, it's working real well. But, my brother, Dumb Denny, I went up to make amends to Dumb Denny. He was an officer with a company in New Jersey, and I drove up, and we began talking, and his wife, Jan, knew this was a different kind of conversation. She excused herself and went off to bed, and I told him why I was there to make amends to him, and that I had been really critical of him because I admired him so much and envied him, and how successful he was and everything else. And he started laughing, and he said, if you owe me an amends and I owe you an amends, he said, I've always admired you. He said, all my life I've been too afraid to change. And he said, you never seem to give a damn about anything. He said, if things weren't going well for you, you go to another country. And that was true. And he said, I've always admired you more than any man I know. He said, you went to Skid Row and you came back. He said, you overcame things I could never overcome. And so I realized that we aren't good or bad, we're just different. We're just different, and we're best friends. And I'll be playing golf with him in a week, and I can't wait. And my brother Terry, my dear brother Terry, who couldn't get this program. He couldn't get it alive. He has it now. But I was sober a few years, and he got into a treatment center, and he got 90 days of sobriety a couple times. But the thing that happened didn't happen for Terry. And I would go home, and Terry would leave town because it must be hard to have a brother who's sober. And so we went up for my parents' 50th wedding anniversary, and all 11 children were there, and 20 great-grandchildren, and 19 great-great-grandchildren. And my parents raised other kids who didn't have any place to go. They just stayed at our house, and they'd just move in one day, and then one day maybe they'd move out, maybe they wouldn't. They were just always there, and somewhere, and they came, and it was a wonderful celebration, and everybody was there but Terry. And Terry was on my amends list, and I so wanted to make direct amends to my dear brother Terry. And he showed up, and he was drunk. And my brothers came to me and said, Terry's drunk. And I said, of course he's drunk. He's an alcoholic. He's got to be drunk. And he said, well, he shouldn't be here like that. I said, that's the only way he can be here. And I knew exactly what had happened to Terry. He was about 3 or 4 hours late. And he'd been right down the street at a bar trying to get enough booze in him to come and be with everybody else. I knew exactly what he was going through. And I said to him, why don't we love him just the way he is? And we did, and I was able to make amends to my brother, Terry. And just a short time after that, they called me and said that Terry was in the hospital and he had cancer. And we know what he was dying of. He was dying of alcoholism. And I went to the hospital, and I got to spend some time with my dear brother, Terry. And we talked like brothers talk. And he had a lot of questions about God, and do I believe that God would love someone like him? And I said, he has to. He has to, because he loved me. And we talked about him and about God and about things like that. And when I left, I asked him a favor. I said, could I hug you? And he'd been a tough kid. He was a boxer, and he'd been a really tough kid. But now he's a frail, wasted man. He was 44 years of age, and he was wasted, and he weighed less than 100 pounds. And he got out of bed, and he was shaky and everything. And I just held him in my arms just for a few seconds. It's hard for an alcoholic to get hugged. And after I was sober, one of the gifts that Alcoholics Anonymous gave me was the university I worked at gave me a scholarship, and I went back and took a degree in philosophy and theology. And I remembered something I studied in theology, and a lot of the old theologians would talk about two kinds of time. There's something called chronos, or chronological time, which is linear, and I'm about out of it. And then there's another kind of time called kairos, which is God's time. And God's time is always right now. It's always now. And so I only hugged my dear brother Terry for a few seconds, but I hugged him forever in God's time. And I realized driving back to North Carolina to be with my wife that God permitted me to always be with my dear brother Terry. And just as I left, the last thing he said to me was, he smiled and he said, I believe I can get sober just like you. And I said, I believe you can too. And my brother Terry died the way I want to die. He died sober. He died surrounded by his family, and he died praying his rosary. And it's just the way I want to die. And on my 20th AA birthday, Terry went home to be with Bill and Bob and all of our friends. And I'm so glad that I didn't have to be resentful or guilty or anything else. I'm so glad that you gave me a way to live, which guarantees that I can walk around any corner in the world and not be afraid of who I'm going to run into. Shortly after he passed away, my mom, this wonderful woman who raised 11 of her own and a bunch of others, also contracted cancer. And she died beautifully. It was long and protracted and painful, and she was one of these spiritual people, who would offer her pain as a prayer for her children. And my brother Larry and I were up, and my niece came to see us, and she said, you have to come to the meeting tonight. My sponsor is speaking, and you have to hear. And I said, maybe I'll listen another time. I said, tonight I thought I'd spend here with Mom. And my mother said, no, you must never do that. She said, you must promise me, boys, you'll always go to Alcoholics Anonymous. And she said to me, those were the people who brought my boys home to me. And she listed the things she wanted in her coffin, and for a number of years, and I tried to find a way to thank my parents for what they had done. I'm sober today because of the prayers of my parents and also the value system that they instilled with me. I couldn't contemplate what I saw in the mirror, as Bill said, anymore. And so as a small token of my gratitude, I would send them a token every year on my birthday. And my mother listed the things she wanted in her coffin. At the very top of the list was my 23-year chip. I can't tell you what you've done for me. You're everything in my life. From the bottom of my heart, the very bottom of my heart, I owe you virtually everything in my life. The relationship with my family, my wife, everything. I'm not the man I want to be. but I'm more the man than I was this time last year. And that's what Alcoholics Anonymous is about. It really is about character building. It really is about doing the right thing. It's about learning how to do the right thing from the experts, and that's the people who are doing it. It's about grace that comes with helping another alcoholic. And just by virtue of our membership here, we have something here that people have never had before, maybe in the history of the world. You know, Bill and Bob met not far from here, and a 15-minute conversation turned into a 5-hour discussion. And Dr. Bob says he speaks my language. And that's what we have. We have the ability to speak the language of the still suffering alcoholic. Some years ago, one of the things I like to do in my hometown is we have a teaching hospital. And at one